Hello, I'm Jackie Lockie, your financial planning maestro. This series of podcasts is aimed at financial planning professionals and also those who are looking to enter the financial planning profession. We will be talking during the podcast about all things Certified Financial Planner certification related, talking to other CFPs around the world, and also we will be dropping in on some new entrants who've just entered the financial planning profession, and we'll be checking up along the way on a regular basis with them to see how they're getting on. I hope you enjoy today's podcast. Hello and welcome. I'm Jackie Lockie, your financial planning maestro. In today's podcast, we are looking at the third in our series of our C Experts podcast, our mini-series, looking at how to approach and to pass the CISI L7 case study assessment en route to becoming a certified financial planner in the UK. And as is usual now, I'm joined by Chris Wicks, who is also a certified financial planner and also a tutor for the Lockie Consultants courses. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Jackie.
Today, we are getting into the nitty gritty. Once we have now done all of our calculations, we're now going to talk about how to make recommendations and write up the plan, aren't we?
We certainly are. And we've covered this in earlier podcasts, but I think, you can never look at the exam standards enough because that's what you're trying to meet. So the CISI has given detailed guidance on what they're looking for, what you need, the standards you need to pass. And it's also given you guidance on the actual structure for the narrative of your report. So if you're very clever, you'll read both and you'll structure your report accordingly, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so let's talk about how to approach writing it up, because I'm a bit odd, maybe a bit odd. You can tell me if I'm a bit odd. Don't say yes to it before I've even told you. But my approach is to do it backwards, actually, in the sense that you write up your assumptions and you put those in your appendix. Then you know what your spreadsheets are now doing and what you're recommending. So you choose which spreadsheets to put in the appendix. So those spreadsheets should be your baseline calculations, assuming client does nothing, followed by the various sets of recommendations that you're going to make along the way to achieve those 4 specific objectives that we've talked about earlier. By the time you've done all of that, you can, when you paste in the spreadsheets, you can paste them in as a table or you can paste them in as a picture. And split them down. You need to make sure that they are clearly legible, no shrinking them down to microscopic print. If the assessor has to get their magnifying glass out to see what your numbers are on your spreadsheets, then you are definitely 100% going to fail. And that has happened to candidates that I have helped in the past. So by the time you've done all of that, then all of your spreadsheets plus your assumptions normally take up about 20 to 25 pages. So then you've got about 35 pages to say everything else that you want to say, haven't you?
Yes, you do.
But then, when it comes to writing it up, we're looking at, you can't just go, well, this is what I'm going to recommend. You've got to have a nice flow and a nice structure to it, haven't you? So you've got to start at the start. Exactly. And like you said, the CISI gives you have a sample financial plan that you could follow the headings, use the headings from the sample financial plan if you want to. If you do a course with us, then we give you some alternative headings. It's entirely up to you. But get yourself a contents page, obviously a covering page, a contents page, and an introduction. And then off you go into basically analysing, explaining what's in your spreadsheets, don't you?
And so I think, the starting point for all that is that having created your spreadsheets is to make notes that, draw out what they each tell you. So, and in fact, you should be doing that as you go along constructing them. So when you've done your baseline calculations so you can see what is this current state of affairs, you make notes when you've done them. What do I draw out of it? And how does that compare with me achieving my goal? And then obviously you'll then use those notes to help develop your recommendations, which you're going to analyze. And you obviously need to be able to show that the recommendations you made work. So that's another set of spreadsheets. So then you can show, then you can explain why you've done it. And those notes are going to then form the starting point for your narrative. If you make brief bullet point notes, the brief bullet point notes can at the very, very least go as place markers into each relevant section.
Yep.
Give you a start for one, and then you can elaborate or not. You don't have to elaborate. You're not getting marks for the beautiful quality of your written English. It needs to be a very clearly, easily understandable document, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yeah. But, and I think one of the difficulties that many people face when they're writing it up is their inability to interact with the client. So, in the case study, there might be some anomalies or things you kind of think, well, that could be read two different ways. I don't really know. Or maybe there's some information missing. Say, I did see a case study that had asset allocation of a particular investment set down, and it only added up to 90%. And you were like, okay, where's the other 10 gone? So is it just a typo and one of those other asset classes should be increased by 10%? Or is there another asset class that should have been added in there? And the answer is, well, it doesn't really matter. Essentially, you need to make an assumption for what you're going to use, and then you just get on with it, don't you? So you've got to keep making those assumptions, make those decisions to keep up that forward momentum. But because of our inability to pick up the phone and ask the client about something like that, then we tend to waffle when we create our financial plans, don't we? And this is where, we talked about at the end of the last podcast that you end up with, 68 pages instead of 58 pages. And you haven't said everything you want to say yet, then you're in trouble, because if you don't use the bullet point format to get into your head, specific things about what you want to tell the client, you just start waffling, don't you? Because you can't talk to them.
Exactly. And each of the topics you cover is covered by an exam standard. So if if in doubt, look back at the exam standard, because you need to say no more or no less than what's needed to actually meet that standard adequately. So just enough explanation to explain it. You don't need to ramble on.
Yes.
You will lose the examiner. We deal with rambling a lot of the time, and we just have to sort of zone out on it. It doesn't really help, because if you ramble, you may actually say something sensible in the middle of your rambling, but it's just been submerged under it, hasn't it? So you need to keep things concise, really.
Yeah. And we do see quite often, or we certainly have seen when we were assessors in the past, obviously, for those listening who don't know us terribly well, we aren't assessors anymore. Well, this is all about the experience that we have had. I personally have seen clients who have buried a recommendation in a huge paragraph that takes up most of a page. And, like you say, they're kind of trying to position what they want to say, but actually the specific recommendation, it might even form as a recommendation in the middle of a paragraph before you've even explored what the options are, before you make the recommendation. So, you've got to think through that step by step and create a plan that has a logical flow for it. And if you jump around all over the place and you kind of go, right, well, this is your baseline, assuming you do nothing, and actually this is what I'm going to recommend, and then you've got the rest of the plan going, well, you could have done this, or you could have done that, or you could consider this, or you could consider that, then actually that doesn't really help. So you really need to, like you say, look at the assessment criteria. The way that all the learning outcomes are set out, they're all set out in a very similar order. And they basically start off with, have you stated the client's objective? So at the start of each of your sections, when you come to write up those 4 objectives, have you stated the client's objective? Yes or no? It's as easy as that. And the number of people who lose those very easy marks where they haven't stated the objective, it's just a bit odd, isn't it?
Well, also, you use the term yes or no. On the marking schedules, it literally says yes or no. So when the marker looks at the assessment, he's going to select it's a drop-down menu on an Excel worksheet, yes or no, if you've not done it. So if so why don't you save yourself some time and cost by checking whether you've actually done it? I was going to say something else very briefly, which is that it's quite understandable when you're producing a weighty document to disappear under it and become quite blinkered. So it is really important, at some stage at the end or perhaps throughout it, that you do actually step back from it and then just read it afresh, maybe the next day, just read it as if you're a third party reading it. just to make sure that what you've actually said makes sense, because you can easily lose track of it. You knew what you meant when you put it down, but actually it doesn't make any sense to a third party. They don't know what you're going on about.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that's one of the things that I recommend people is that they leave it, stuff it in a drawer, or just leave it alone on their PCs for, if they can, 48 hours, maybe a little bit longer, just to let your brain decompress. Because like you say, when you're typing it, you know what you mean to say. But if the doorbell went, or, you had to let the cat out in the middle of a conversation, then you stop mid-sentence, don't you? You stop typing, you do what you have to do, you're distracted, you come back again, and you think, right, in my head, I know that I've written that. Where actually the reality is that you've only written half a sentence, and then you've skipped on to something else. And unless your brain fills in the gap, so unless you have that downtime, then you don't actually notice. One of the other things that I quite commonly see is that people contradict themselves, don't they? That they state something as obvious early on in the plan, and then, like you say, they get into the thick of it, they start to disappear under the weight of it, and then they think, they get to a different section and think, gosh, I'm not sure if I've mentioned something about that. So then they just say something really vague. Like, one of my favorite phrases is, well, there are two. One of them is, obviously, as you can see. And I go, really? I couldn't see. And then the other one is, thinking about, well, you could consider doing something. And those two things we don't want in a financial plan, unless it is extremely obvious, because it certainly hasn't been obvious for me. And I kind of thought I knew what I was looking at when I used to mark the assessments. And B, saying you should consider things aren't recommendations. And the problem with this financial plan is that you have to make firm recommendations in order to pass the assessment. If you say, well, you can't meet your retirement planning objective, for example, then you can't just go, dust my hands, never mind, you can't meet it, that's it, okay, end of story. You have to say, well, what should they do instead? Not what they could do instead, but what they should do instead, which maybe if these were real clients, you would have a conversation with them about what they could consider doing, wouldn't you?
Exactly. I totally agree with all that. And I think, you really, thinking about what you've just said there as well, that when you write your narrative, it doesn't need to be flowery text. Okay, so you don't need to put in any superfluous verbiage at all. You can just make straightforward, simple statements, either as an observation of the current situation or recommendation, and you just use straight, simple, basic language to give it. Don't bother putting things like "as you see" and that type of phrase, because it really doesn't add anything to the text whatsoever. I mean, of course they can see it, you've just written it down. So you don't need to tell them they can see it because it's there, And I want to just make one other broad point, which is that when you look at the sections of the plan, every bit of the plan needs your proper amount of attention. So there are key chunky bits on retirement planning, on protection, estate planning, and the like, which obviously will be given attention by you because they're the obvious big bits. But then there are the smaller bits that such as reviews, action plan, and the like, which you need to make sure you concentrate on and give it the attention it needs, and not just dash them off as an afterthought, where you haven't properly constructed it, because you can literally fail the section for having given some great content on the key part of the topics, and then having not bothered to do the bits, the topping and the tailing, if you like, your introduction, your conclusions, if you like. It's a very common fallacy, isn't it? People they write a big essay and then they dash off the conclusions. So don't fall into that trap. You've got to continue being switched on all the way through the whole thing.
Yeah. One of the areas where I think people, because it's a marathon, not a sprint, isn't it? We say that and people kind of roll their eyes at me, but it's true. You're in this for the long haul, and it takes that 150 to 200 hours of work in order to get through and pass this assessment. So there are going to be times you get highs and lows. You're going to go through a whole gambit of emotions where, particularly if you're on training courses with us, you're going to love us and hate us and be frustrated by us and, maybe hate us again. But those whole range of emotions are completely normal. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to run out of steam at the 11th hour. And I particularly find the most common area where I see failing, when I see people who come back to me who failed their first assessment, and I look at their feedback sheets, by far and away, the majority who fail their first assessment are failing on the estate planning bit. And when I say to them, what happened? They all go, oh, Jackie, I had enough of the clients by that time. I run out of time. I spent all my time on the retirement planning. And because I got in a pickle with my spreadsheets, I had to do what you were saying earlier, Chris, and step back and rethink, redo them all. Then I had to do all the protection calculations. And I just given up the will to live by the time I got to the estate planning bit. And the number of people I see where the IHT calculations, assuming a baseline, so that is as the details are in the fact find, the IHT calculations are incorrect. And what the assessors are doing is they're basically it's putting them off marking the entirety of the rest of that section. And it's like they feel, you can see it in the comments that they write. I can feel for them a little bit because it feels like they're wading through treacle. And all of that is because you have run yourself out of steam, you're out of time, and you think, oh, God, I hate these clients. I've been grappling with them for the last 10 weeks, and I just want to get shot of this plan and get on with the rest of my life. But by not doing yourself justice for those last parts, and, as you just mentioned, a paragraph on reviews, I mean, you could do that with the introduction before you even started, couldn't you? But actually, all of these component parts add up to critical marks. And in the last round of assessments, I saw 3 people who failed, who passed overall, got more than 65%, but who failed 2 or 3 of the learning outcomes. And they got 50% in each of them, 50. Now, you only need 51 or more to pass. And they got 50. So apart from the fact that they were kicking themselves because they could have passed in their first assessment, when we looked at the reason about why they had failed, then all of them had failed the estate planning section, and all of them had not paid enough attention and provided correct IHT calculations right at the very start.
I think as well that what we find quite a bit is that people literally do something like, you've got an IHT problem, I recommend you go and see a solicitor, and then they think that they're done.
Yeah.
And that's not done. So you'll have been through a process to carry out a comprehensive analysis of their retirement planning, etc., and come up with some solutions. And you need to give the same amount of attention to your analysis on inheritance tax, and you need to give the same level of critical reasoning to it, because it's probably a growing problem for people, if their financial affairs are in order, if you want to put it that way, and they're going to meet their retirement target, etc. It's quite possible they're going to have a growing estate. So there needs to be, A, you need to observe that in the numbers that you've crunched, and B, you need to then comment about this so that you can set the scene for them, and then you can then make your recommendations. And as Jackie's pointed out, if it was a real client, you'd probably have a chat with them about it and talk through the possibilities before arriving at whatever works best for those clients. In this particular case, you can't do that. You've actually got to come off the fence and just say, make a recommendation that is reasonable for those clients about it, and it needs to be, in reasonable detail. If you think about the solicitor bit, really in this scenario, they may well need to go and see a solicitor, but what they're going to do is the solicitor's going to execute the documents you're recommending the client sets up, whether it's a type of will or a lifetime trust or whatever have you.
Yeah.
And again, if you're not, one of the problems I suspect with people is that they're not familiar with estate planning. So just as in an earlier podcast we said, go away and beef up on Excel. If you really aren't sure about inheritance tax, this is your cue to go away and beef up on it. There's loads of material online all about it. Make sure that you're up to scratch technically with it, so that you can then come up with a good analysis of it and also good recommendations.
Yeah. And when we think about putting together an action plan, the easiest way I think about it is, imagine that the action plan is a kind of tear out document, a kind of tick box tear out document that the clients are going to tear out of their financial plan, that is going to be a short clean snapshot of exactly who's doing what and when are they doing it. So you don't have to have your recommendations or why you're recommending things in your action plan, because that's actually in the body of your report, isn't it? You know, you don't want to waste pages and waste paragraphs repeating yourself. If something is already explained fully in your recommendations section, under each of the objectives that you've already analysed and made those recommendations for, then your action plan should just be one of those tear-off sheets, shouldn't it?
Exactly. So in each of your sections, you've given your recommendations, which needs a thing to be done. So your action plan is a list of the things to be done, who's doing them, and when they need to be done by, which is a table, basically.
Yeah. One of the things that I remember when I was an assessor that the assessors hated, and that was that somebody had put under the column that said, when should they be done? They had said ASAP for everything.
Yes. So again, you know, of course, the plan is a bit of a work of fiction, isn't it? And it does vary from what you do with a real client, but you need to put a sensible, reasonable date in there, you know.
And there are going to be some things that naturally would be more urgent, like if the client's got no will or something like that. Maybe they're unmarried and got kids but no will. I mean, you would naturally push that to, you know, the more urgent pile, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. So there, you know, when it comes to estate planning, there's death planning, wills and like, and there's lifetime planning. And the sequencing for any form of estate planning is you do the death planning first, because that's the baseline situation. If you go under a bus tomorrow, at least there's a structure for your estate, and then you do the lifetime planning, which is always much, much more complex.
Yeah. And when we're looking at marking the plans, once the plan is finished, we ask everybody to shove it in a drawer or leave it on your PC untouched for a few days to let your brain decompress. Go back and then read the case study, then read your financial plan to see whether you've answered everything that has been asked of you in the case study. Assess it against the assessment criteria that you've been given in your candidate guidance. So give it 100% for your first assessment to get, even if you can't get across the line on the first assessment, you'll be within a gnat's whisker away. And then believe me that the stress is seriously lifted for the second submission because you've given it your all in the first submission. But one vital thing to remember in all of this when you're writing up your plan is do not plagiarize the sample financial plan that the CISI has given you. Really important.
They use software, don't they? They're using software to check plagiarism on it. And I think you mentioned in earlier discussions that one area people can go wrong, quite unwittingly, of course, is if you work in a firm where there have been other CFP people who've now passed, and they've come back and they've revitalized the firm's financial planning report templates. That will have probably come from their submission, which is fine as far as it goes, except it's not fine for you, because the system will pick up the fact that you've actually used text that originated with your colleague. And you will get in trouble over it, and you don't want that. So you, unfortunately, I mean, the reality with the whole thing is you're just starting from scratch, making a bunch of spreadsheets from scratch, creating a document, all your own work. In fact, you're going to sign a declaration saying it's all your own work. So that's what it needs to be, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in total, 60 pages, what we're looking at, 20,000 words, something like that? 15,
but it is something that's obviously doable, but it's particularly doable if you plan your time properly. Yes. So if you break it down into tasks, each of which has a set amount of time to it, almost imagine like chapters, if you like. I mean, the spreadsheets are a chapter if you want. So you need to do them all first, and then you can then do the other bits that are substantive, give them a certain number of days to do them in. And if you do it in that way, you'll actually get it all done in a reasonable time frame.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. But I think, we can't emphasize this enough, that each of the bits is a building block, isn't it? So you're constructing a building block. And then when you put all the building blocks together, you really then need to look at what you've created to make sure that they all actually do hang together properly, that they're coherent and they tie in with each other. Because, of course, the four key financial planning areas interact with each other, don't they? And it's that, and you do need to make that interaction. You need to observe it and make sure recommendations reflect the interaction all the way through so it hangs together.
Yeah. And in our next podcast, we are going to talk you through what happens if you are unsuccessful in your first submission and what you can do about it. And that one's going to be packed with lots of tips from the pair of us. So, Chris, thanks very much again for joining me today.
You're welcome.
It's really interesting, isn't it, to listen to different people who have different experiences of gaining their certified financial planner certification, or maybe developing the financial planning profession at large. If you know anybody who you think might be interested in listening to any of these podcasts, then please do pass on our details. That's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. See you again soon. Bye for now.